He pressed his eye to the periscope as dawn smeared the horizon, and a steel ribbon hissed along the shore below, an unbroken line of boxcars and a black locomotive, carrying men and material toward defenses that might cost American lives. From 60 feet below, Commander Eugene B. Fluckey, transcription variants, Fluckey, verify, had a single, terrible, brilliant idea. Make a submarine sink a train. It sounded impossible. Subs killed ships with torpedoes. They crippled convoys with deck guns and increasingly with rockets from improvised launchers. But a train running along a narrow coastal causeway moved fast, hugged the shore, and could vanish into tunnels and embankments before a torpedo could be brought to bear. Rockets could hit shore emplacements, but their accuracy on a fleeting, rolling target was never guaranteed. Shelling the track disabled it for a time, until men with picks returned. Fluckey wanted permanence. Stop a train in its tracks, not just scare it off for a night. USS Barb was a Gatto-class submarine with an outsized appetite for audacity. She carried a record of patrols that had become the stuff of submarine legend. Successful torpedo attacks, daring surface engagements, and earlier experiments that suggested a sub could strike ashore in ways the Japanese did not expect. Under Fluckey's command, she had been altered in small, ingenious ways. Sleds for rockets bolted to the deck, racks modified for launching Mark 51 rockets that, until recently, people would have considered the province of aircraft and shore batteries. Fluckey had earned a reputation for conspicuous boldness. Before this patrol, he had led actions that had put him in the spotlight for the Navy's highest decorations. He was a commander who believed rules were starting points and that war rewarded those who could imagine a different tool for a given job. He trusted his crew, and his crew trusted that when he asked for volunteers for something dangerous and unusual, he would do everything he could to bring them back. By mid-1945, the map of targets in the Pacific had thinned. Merchant shipping, once plentiful and easily preyed upon, had become scarce in areas the subs could reach. The strategic logic of submarine warfare was evolving. Some commanders responded by cruising farther, hunting supply lines across oceanic choke points. Others, like Fluckey, began to think in novel terms. If you could not find a large target at sea, could you create decisive impact at shore? The Barb had already tested rockets against coastal batteries, and the experiments showed that submarines could influence land operations. The next step required a smaller instrument of sabotage, a way to strike where a ship could not go. The target was a coastal railroad that hugged the shore of Karafuto. Transliteration in sources varies, verify, a lifeline moving troops, ammunition, and supplies along a narrow strip of land. At night the trains ran with eerie regularity. Convoys of cars threaded through cuttings across short trestles and along embankments where the sea licked the ballast. Destroy the rail, and you force the enemy to reroute, to slow, to pour men and materiel into defenses along the coast. Worse for the defenders, the damage was immediate, visible, and humiliating. If the Japanese authorities showed it to their own people, the psychological impact would be substantial. But how to make that damage stick? Torpedoes needed depth and a long run. Rockets lacked the pinpoint timing. Shore bombardment meant surfacing close to shore, inviting coastal batteries and patrol craft. So the idea hardened toward something else, a small explosive placed directly under the rail and set to detonate when the locomotive passed overhead. A scuttling charge small enough to be carried by a handful of men, armed with a trigger simple and reliable, a micro switch that would close under the weight of metal wheels and send current to dry cell batteries. The concept was elegant in its simplicity and lethal in its consequences. Change a rail into a tripwire for disaster. Selection of the team was instant and brutal. Fluckey wanted volunteers who could operate in cramped darkness, who swam well, who could be trusted to keep a secret, and who had nothing to lose in terms of dependence at home. He asked for unmarried men who could be detached from shipboard duties and trusted with improvisation under fire. The list, once trimmed and approved, read like a roster of builders and tinkerers. Saunders, Hatfield, Seaver, Newland, Klingelsmith, Richard, Marcus, Walker. Names that would later be inked beneath commendations and enter the quiet inventories of a submarine's legacy. On the deck of the Barb, during nights between patrols, they fabricated a device from the things sailors could scrounge. The charge itself was roughly 55 pounds, compact enough to be hauled over a length of sand and rocks, heavy enough to produce the rupture they sought. They wrapped explosives in canvas, sealed seams with layers of grease and wax, and bolstered the unit inside a container fashioned to survive surf and sand. The detonator would not be a pressure plate or a complicated timed fuse. It would be a micro-switch, mechanical, tiny, and remarkably robust. When the wheel flange of a locomotive passed over it, the switch would be depressed, closing a circuit to a dry cell battery. A current would flow, the detonator would heat, and one small, precisely placed charge would become a violent rupture under the rails. It sounds almost naive, and yet every part of the plan embraced redundancy. They made the micro-switch sensitized to a small travel distance so that even the first axle of a heavy locomotive would trigger it. They tested the switch in mock setups beneath planks in the submarine's cramped torpedo room, listening to the click of success like a promise. Several batteries were wired in parallel so that a single leaky cell would not doom the mission. Waterproofing was painstaking, jars and cans oiled and sealed against salt. A spare detonator and a manual arming pin were kept handy, should something fail at the last second. There were other mundane preparations. Inflatable rafts, rubber boats stowed beneath the conning tower were checked for leaks. Paddles were lashed and extra sets of hands trained in silent launches and recoveries. The shore party rehearsed movements in the dark corridor ways of the submarine, how to exit, how to fold into a craft, how to wedge a bomb beneath a rail without making a sound. They practiced counting the cadence of distant engines and the rhythm of surf so they could tell, by ear, when they had minutes or seconds to act. Timing was critical. The crew studied tide tables, moon phases, and wind charts. A bright moon made it harder to cross a beach unnoticed. High surf complicated landings. Low tide could expose more beach but force paddlers into currents. They wanted clouds that would swallow silhouette while giving enough light to move without stumbling. They watched for pattern. Trains that moved at night on schedule, long enough for a team to get into position and leave before dawn patrols began. Reconnaissance from periscope kept them informed. A single lamp on a distant locomotive, a pattern of headlight flashes, the slow chuff of an engine at a distance. 2 trains had passed within 22 minutes of one another on a previous night, each pass a cruel countdown. If a team had misjudged that rhythm, they could have been caught in the open while a locomotive tore across the empty shore. Fluckey was methodical. He did not romanticize risk. Each man selected for the shore party signed up with eyes open. He briefed them in the wardroom like an officer explaining a bridge plan. Objectives, timelines, withdrawal points, contingencies. They were told to avoid militias and villages if possible. The goal was material disruption, not civilian slaughter. The ethical line was deliberate. Fluckey emphasized speed and extraction because, above innovation, he wanted to preserve his crew. His orders made clear the intention: strike and return. There were technical debates beneath that surface, the sort that seat officers and petty officers hashed out in the dim between watches. How to anchor the charge to the sleeper. How to prevent sand and grit from jamming the micro-switch. Would the micro-switch trip under the locomotive's flange, or would ballast tamping give it a false reading? Engineers suggested smoothing the railbed and inserting a small board beneath the switch to prevent it sinking into sand. Someone remembered an old trick from demolition manuals. A sheet of thin metal beneath the device would focus shock upward rather than dissipate it into the earth, amplifying the effect on the rail itself. While the gadgetry was rehearsed, so too was the human choreography. On the night of the operation, the shore party would stretch out along the sand in a line, a web of bodies moving against the literal dark. The paddles would whisper in the surf. The first man to step ashore would be the one to check for mines, tripwires, and the obvious signs of a sentry. The second man would bear the charge. 2 would dig, others would keep watch and listen. The arming procedure was simple in theory and terrifying in practice. Secure the device beneath the rail, affix the micro-switch under the flange path, connect the leads to the dry cell bank, seal and hide the connections in a jam jar full of oil and grease to keep seawater from shorting the circuit. Then retract, fold the rafts, and put distance between themselves and the scene long enough for the blast waves and any patrols to pass. There were moments of levity amid the tension. Not bravado, but small human light in a dark plan. Sailors smoked in whispers and swapped corny jokes to steady the hands. A petty officer played a battered harmonica that was muffled to prevent detection, but kept men centered. A young seaman, Marcus, hummed the same 2 bars of a hymn he'd heard at a shore leave months before. It was not a prayer so much as a rhythm to pace his breathing. Not everyone was sanguine. One petty officer, Hatfield, ran through the checklist as if to ward off superstition. Saunders refused to carry a second pistol, insisting he had no need of a weapon he would not use. Walker, who had once worked on railroads before the war, studied the sleepers with a craftsman's eye. Wood grain, spike placement, the likely yield point of a tie under pressure. Sever and Newland argued at one point about the best waterproofing compound to use on the battery caps. Klingelsmith, the unit's electrician, simply tightened connections and asked for more tape. They waited for a night when the sea, the moon, and the schedule aligned. The barb lay in a shallow trough beyond a blind of rocks, periscope up, hull-hugging darkness. Men below breathed with the cold. On deck, the sound of hammering had ceased. Fluckey watched through glass as the shoreline swallowed and spat light, as small human shapes moved along the sand in the distance. He had the luxury of being the man below the ocean, the one who could not be seen, but who could see everything the sea allowed him to reveal. At the appointed hour, the rafts were slipped. Sheets of rubber sighed as they were inflated and eased into the surf. Paddles took synchronous strokes in the black. The men in the inflatable moved like shadows, bodies low in the boat, eyes tuned to the headlamp rhythm of distant watchfires. Approaching the coast was an act of surgical patience. Glide, halt, listen. The tide licked at the edges of their craft, trying to take them where they did not want to go. Sand shifted under their knees when they landed. For a heartbeat there was nothing but the salt breath of the ocean and the slow beat of a heart. They hugged the scrub behind the beach, folding themselves into hollows of dune grass as if the wind were a cloak. Walker ran his hand along the rail in the dark, feeling the cold of steel and the pattern of bolts. There was a moment, centuries in a man's memory, when the job transformed from abstract to terrifyingly real. The switch had to be placed within inches of where a wheel would pass, and there would be no margin for error. They worked with the economy of men who had rehearsed every motion. Digging in that dark was more than muscle. It was an effort to keep the sound down. Hands pried ballast and pulled sand into bowls. The 55-pound charge was slid into place, and nestling began. Klingelsmith's fingers trembled for a second as he connected the wires, then steadied as years of wiring and steady nerves took over. The jar with the batteries and joiner sat under a rock to keep it from splashing. They sealed the cap with oil the size of a coin. Richard whispered a signal, and every man held his breath. At the far edge of their hearing, a faint sound that might have been a surf insect or the creak of a distant pole signaled the approach of metal. They froze, hearts stuttering. The night's quiet compressed time into tight segments. One man whispered the number 22, as if invoking the earlier near miss where 2 trains had passed within 22 minutes, an anecdote that had become a private superstition on board. Each passing headlight along the far horizon was a possible train, each distant thrum of wheels a countdown. Back aboard the Barb, Fluckey watched the horizon through his periscope while the ship sat low. He had to contend with more than just the immediate mission, coastal patrols, searchlights, and the inevitable curiosity of shore batteries meant the sub could not linger. The rescue plan was precise: leave a gap of time between the team's return and the sub's approach to shore to avoid being spotted by any escorts drawn to the blast. The extraction point was a shadow of rock just beyond a shoal. They had practiced paddling to that shadow, climbing into boats and cutting a line before any light could make them a prize. Inside the submarine, the mood was a taut string. Men who had been rowing now tried to make themselves small in the dark, while the sub waited for a cue only a few would hear. The radio, the periscope, and the captain's steady voice were the only assurances. Signals would be simple: a light 3 times, or a coded sound on a shell. But they all knew the real signals were whether the rafts returned, and whether the tiny seal of a jar kept it secret. On the beach, the last connections were made. The micro-switch lay in a shallow bed, bridged from rail to jaw with a small pad, camouflaged with gravel and some careful stuffing. The detonator was live, but safe, until it was not. One man, Saver, slipped the final safety pin from the device itself. The action was small and soundless, but the movement dispersed a pressure that none of them wanted to breathe about later. They had all practiced the jerk, the minimal motion designed to avoid noise. The signal for withdrawal was a single soft cough 3 times, no more. They slid back into the surf like ghosts, pulling oars with practiced quiet. Behind them, the rail shimmered in the moonlight, a pale snake. Ahead, like a distant heartbeat, a glow began to creep along the coast, the headlamp of a locomotive. The men in the raft did not speak. They listened to the low mechanical song of wheels on rail, the progress of something massive and indifferent toward their handiwork. The sea swallowed their strokes. The sound came closer, a metallic harmony that could be measured in heartbeats now, not minutes. On the barb, Fluckey's jaw was set. The ship rode low and careful. He had one line of sight and one option. Wait until the shore party was aboard and the rafts cut free, then make a discreet run out to sea under the cover of darkness and whatever clouds the night would lend them. Behind him the war still churned. Ahead, a single explosion could force an enemy to divert men and resources and reveal in simple terms that innovation could alter the choices of men in command. There was no certainty in the plan, only the accumulation of small, calculated decisions. If the switch failed, the train might pass and the mission would have to be abandoned, leaving the team exposed. If a patrol found the first tracks and sent men to investigate, the party could be trapped. If the detonator functioned, the effects could range from a ruptured rail and a stranded locomotive to a catastrophic derailment with secondary explosions if the cars carried ordnance. None of those possibilities were presented to the men as desirable outcomes in detail. They were given as realities and ordered to prepare and to move. The raft scraped against the rocks of the pickup point. Men clambered in and wrapped blankets around salt-caked shoulders. The oars folded into a cadence, and the small craft slid away. The swell took them, and the night swallowed their outlines. On the horizon, and now alarmingly close, was a point of light growing brighter, a headlamp that would soon split the darkness like a blade. Fluckey watched through the periscope as the headlamp swept the shore in a rhythm and then fixed, like an eye. The train had sensed the geography of the coastline and was now on the straightaway. A distant burst of static reached the conning tower radio, where the bridge watch listened intently. It could have been wind or the chatter of a ship out of range. The thing that mattered now was time, and the ratio of men to seconds. The boat drifted, engines barely humming, her hull a silhouette beneath the cloud bank. On the beach, the shore party crouched in a raft that pitched and rolled on the swell. Marcus chewed a piece of leather until it was soft. Saunders wrapped his arm around a canvas so it would not slap the hull. Hatfield kept his eyes on the dark line where sea met sky. Each man felt the tug of the world back home and wondered, briefly, selfishly, how a simple piece of metal, or a single decision, could change what would be written about them. They were a dozen breaths from the launch point when the first distinct vibration curled through the earth, an inhuman mechanical shudder that made the sand under them announce its own response. Somewhere ahead, metal met rail with a rhythm that could not be mistaken, the locomotive's wheels hitting the joint bars, the iron palm of a heavy machine continuing its march. A whistle called somewhere down the line, raw and unpracticed. The team counted breaths, not seconds. Each inhale was a precise metronome. Behind them, in the sub, the captain waited with the patience of a man who had made hard decisions before and intended to see this one through. He could not know from his sealed vantage every minor failure the men were now countering. A wire slightly frayed, a clump of sand that wanted to blind the switch, a paddle that had taken on a small pocket of water. He trusted that the measures they had taken would hold. A distant light blinked, searchlights rotating like patient angels. Far away, a dog barked from some coastal outpost. No alarm yet. The headlamp of the locomotive drew nearer, its beam cutting through cloud. The men in the raft tightened their grips and pulled up to the shadow of rock where the pickup had been planned. There, they would slide into hiding until the signal to return. They had to make the distance with no sound, and with a speed inconceivable to those who would later read the reports. Counting down, the submariners held the fragile moment between the planting and the surge of events that would follow. The device lay beneath the rail, its jar sealed, its microswitch waiting like a mousetrap. For a sliver of time, the world paused, a breath arrested by the reality of a mechanism that could not be unmade once the locomotive's weight did its job. And then, in the horizon's thin strip of light, the locomotive's pattern resolved into a single procession of metal and fire. The sound of the engine became a shape that moved faster than the men could track with eyes alone. The first wheel spun into the zone above their hidden device. The microswitch felt the brief iron kiss of flange on metal. The circuit closed. Current ran through dry cells sealed in a jar. A small flame leapt a microscopic distance, and the detonator answered. For a moment there was nothing but the ordinary sounds of a train, the steady clack of joints, the sigh of steam, the inevitability of motion. Then there was an instant that broke the world into before and after. The blast did not announce itself like a movie explosion. It began as a pressure, an almost inaudible compression that moved along the ground and into the men's rib cages. Sand leapt into the air in a slow, trembling sheet. The rail bent like a struck bow. The wooden tie under the charge split outward, and the spike that held the rail lost its purchase. In the next heartbeat, metal spoke, high, terrible, and the locomotive's forward momentum found no continuous rail to guide it. Wheels ratcheted and ground, flanges chewed air, and the engine lurched to one side. Crewmen on the train, if there were any near the point of rupture, would later describe smoke and the shriek of couplings. But the shore party did not stay to see or to learn those details. From 20 yards away, the men in the raft felt the concussion as a wave that rolled over the black water and lifted their craft. A fragment of timber, one of the shattered ties, slammed into the surf with a wet thud. A line of cars behind the engine telescoped or piled as though someone had shoved their ends together on a toy track. Somewhere amid the tangle of iron, a secondary boom suggested the presence of fuel or ammunition. Plumes of flame punched into the night sky and reflected in the sea as the wreck smoked and burned. On the beach, instinct overcame training. Hands moved by muscle memory, roll into hollows, flatten faces to dune grass, press boots into sand. No one cheered. No one laughed. For a slender moment, the only human sound was the measured intake of lungs. Then orders, silent, rehearsed, sent the men toward the shadows where the paddles waited. From the conning tower, Fluckey saw the first bloom of orange through his periscope, and then the ragged fringe of smoke that followed. He had prepared for the moment, and yet there was a human element to the sight that machine eyes could not calibrate, the knowledge that something irreversible had occurred. Barb's hull creaked as the men below eased their breath. The captain eased the controls and felt, almost physically, the tug of the sea as the submarine prepared to move. The rescue plan demanded distance. The shore party would not linger to watch the full extent of the damage. Their extraction had to precede any effective counteraction. The men paddled like men possessed, every stroke a prayer for silence. Behind them, the light from the wreck flared and guttered as flames met sea breeze. For a few wild seconds, the shore seemed to be a theater of fire and metal, then began to tremble with other sounds. Distant shouts, the crackle of a field telephone somewhere ashore, and less than 8 minutes after the blast, searchlights that stabbed the clouds like needles. Barb did not wait for the searchlights. She slipped her moorings, bow lowered, and ran silent toward deeper water. Her first order of business was to dive. She sank to periscope depth, where the captain could still see and listen, without being seen. The crew read the sea in noise and shadow, the staccato thudding of an outboard motor, the pop and hiss of a patrol craft's engines, and the angry illumination of rotating beams that skimmed the surf like hunting animals. Depth charges were a real danger. Barb's commander had trained his men to anticipate their cadence and to ride the shock with a cool focus. The hull vibrated as charges detonated at ranges that were terrifyingly near, and every man felt the submarine's bones shudder. But Barb's design and her crew's discipline turned the shocks into measured inconveniences, immensely stressful, yes, but survivable. The coastal defenders reacted quickly. Patrol craft converged, and shore batteries sent tracer streaks into the night where they suspected the submarine or the rafts might be. Japanese reports later framed the incident with grand language, and wartime propaganda amplified destruction into cinematic catastrophe. Those contemporary pronouncements claimed extensive devastation and heavy casualties. American intelligence assessments, working with intercepted signals and the submarine's own after-action reports, painted a different picture. One emphasizing military disruption and psychological effect rather than precise casualty counts. The exact balance between those claims remains a subject for historians and archivists to weigh. Numbers and human losses, when asserted outright in either direction, ought to be treated with caution unless corroborated by reliable, verifiable records. For the men on the rafts, narrative and debate were luxuries they did not have. They pulled, they ducked under searchlight cones, they cut lines, and they hauled themselves into the waiting embrace of Barb's waiting arms. The boarding was quick and practiced, boat against hull, hands finding grips, sailors swung aboard by practiced wrists. The submarine's crew hauled the rafts in, stowed them, and sealed hatches with the same careful efficiency with which the charge had been assembled hours before. There was no high-fiving. There were only brief nods and the soft sound of men trying to recompose themselves. Barb's immediate survival was not merely an act of reflex, it was the product of planning and of a commander's insistence. Insistence on withdrawal windows, on the quality of rafts, and on a rescue plan that minimized exposure. Fluckey's decisions had repeatedly placed a premium on the return leg. His philosophy of risk management was to accept audacity, but prepare escape. That ethic preserved lives that night. When the submarine finally put distance between herself and the hunting lights, she ran under a cloud bank and dove deep enough to escape the most worried of depth charge patterns. Patrols rocked the sea with engines and mounted artillery fire along the shore, but could not, in that black and chaotic hour, find a precise kill. In the hours after the explosion, Barb's crew worked methodically through the shock. They reported equipment performance, logged the number of rockets left aboard, checked watertight integrity, and wrote terse notes of crew welfare. On the wardroom board, a small sheet would later be affixed with a terse entry: mission accomplished, shore party recovered, no casualties. The list of technical successes was precise. The microswitch had worked, the dry cell battery array had delivered the necessary current, the scuttling charge had breached the rail, extraction had been successful. Those facts, when stitched into official reports, would form the skeleton of after-action evaluations. The tactical effects were immediate and visible. The wreck blocked the line for a time and disrupted scheduled movements. Repair parties, teams of laborers and soldiers, were forced to reroute supplies and to invest time and materiel in clearing and relaying track. That reallocation of effort was exactly the kind of friction Fluckey hoped to introduce. Japanese commanders, anxious after the raid, ordered more frequent coastal patrols, sandbagged embankments, and sent troops to guard stretches of vulnerable track. The defensive posture along that strip of coast hardened. Resources that might otherwise have been used at the front were tied to the littoral. The raid had produced a cascade of administrative and military actions that extended the mission's effect beyond the blast itself. There was also an intangible consequence: the psychological shock. Submarine commanders, until then mostly associated with torpedoes and deck gun surface actions, had demonstrated a different set of capabilities: covert land insertion, direct sabotage, and targeted disruption inland. That multiplicity of threat made coastal commanders rethink the calculus of security. A network of rail lines and depots now required protection from a class of attacker who could appear from, and vanish into, the sea. Intelligence reports across the theater began to note a new awareness on the part of Japanese coastal commands and a creeping paranoia about the security of beaches and railheads. Barb did not rest on the laurels of a single night. The operation infused a wider pattern of activity on that patrol. Over the following days, she made further reconnaissance of shore installations and, where conditions allowed, employed her deck rockets and gunfire against small shore targets, harassing supply points and battery positions. These follow-up strikes were part of a campaign to keep coastal defenders off balance and to exploit the mobility that submarine platforms increasingly offered. Each intervention nudged military thinking a fraction further toward accepting the submarine not merely as an undersea hunter, but as a versatile, steerable threat. When the submarine returned to friendly waters, reports from the crew were cross-checked with signals intelligence, local reconnaissance, and, where possible, captured documents and later patrols. Historians have argued over how to weigh the operation's strategic effect. Some emphasize its tactical ingenuity and the lesson it taught about using submarines to project influence ashore. Others see it as a daring but limited action in the larger sweep of the Pacific War. And there is a particular claim that has followed this operation into histories and popular accounts, that it represented the only Allied ground combat operation on the Japanese home islands during the war. That assertion circulates widely and has been repeated in museum exhibits and books, but scholars debate its definition, what constitutes home islands, how to classify marine raids versus ground operations, and what archival evidence supports exclusivity. As with many wartime claims, the strongest approach is to present the story as contemporaneous participants, and later commentators reported it, while acknowledging disputed points and the need for documentary verification, before stating uniqueness as an absolute. Recognition came not as spectacle, but as formalized commendation. Fluckey's reputation as a commander who blended imagination with a hard eye for risk management only grew. He and members of his crew received official acknowledgments for daring and effectiveness during the patrol. Citations noted the innovative use of a submarine to strike shore infrastructure and the skillful extraction of a volunteer team under fire. The men who had paddled ashore, Saunders, Hatfield, Sever, Newland, Klingelsmith, Richard, Marcus, Walker, were named in dispatches and in the quiet pages of military record. The patrol, by its own account, recorded no Purple Hearts awarded to its participants for this action. The men returned pain-torn in places by cold and strain, but without combat casualties on the manifest. That statistic, 0 Purple Hearts for an operation that could have gone catastrophically wrong, became part of the narrative that circulated in the submarine community and in post-war remembrances. Post-war, the story of the raid became a touchstone for debates about naval innovation. The improvised Mark 51 rockets and the experiment of sending men ashore to sabotage infrastructure were early signs that naval platforms could be adapted for missions far beyond their designer's original intent. In the Cold War's decades that followed, navies would refine the idea of submarines as platforms for strategic missiles, cruise missiles, and special operations insertion. It would be a considerable stretch to credit one patrol with creating that trajectory, but the raid's conceptual lineage is clear. A willingness to bend doctrine, to mix sea and land effects, and to treat submarines as nodes in a larger theater of operations foreshadowed future developments in undersea warfare. There is also a quieter legacy, one of objects and memory. Items from that patrol, decommissioned equipment, and a battle flag associated with barbs survived the post-war scrappings and the long attrition of material culture. Those artifacts traveled from locker rooms to museum cases, where their tones and stains gained the patina of history. A flag from Barb's service was preserved and later displayed, Submarine Force Museum location to verify, its fabric bearing the small embroidered marks of campaigns and the larger, unwritten marks of decisions made in the dark. Visitors standing before such relics often felt the odd juxtaposition of something small and cloth-bound, holding the weight of a daring idea. The men themselves dispersed into the long arc of post-war life. Some stayed in the Navy, their careers cushioned by the recognition of a patrol that had tested doctrinal boundaries. Others returned to civilian trades, rail work, carpentry, electrical work, carrying with them the memory of the surf, the taste of salt, and the knowledge that one night had tested the limits of their courage. They did not seek fame. Their stories were told in reunion halls, in family living rooms, and in the occasional oral history preserved in archives. Those who wrote memoirs gave their accounts with a reticence that belied the drama. They framed the mission as a job done, a duty fulfilled, and a risk carefully taken. As for the submarine itself, Barb's life after the war was no less subject to the iron economy of naval fleets. Ships that had been exalted by wartime necessity found peacetime budgets indifferent. Many were decommissioned and scrapped as navies modernized and technologies advanced. Barb, too, saw her metal parted and her silhouette dissolved into other uses. What remained was story, records, and the objects chosen for remembrance. The ethical contour of the raid never entirely dissipated. Historians and ethicists debated the line between military necessity and the risks to non-combatants. Contemporary Japanese sources and wartime propaganda presented narratives shaped by their own aims. Allied intelligence and American accounts presented theirs. Responsible narration resists laundry list declarations and instead puts contested claims in relief. Here is what was done, here is what was reported, here is what can be corroborated, and here are the gaps that require archives and testimony. But stripped of polemic, the operation illuminates a few persistent truths about warfare. It shows how constraints breed invention. When conventional methods failed to produce effect, men on a submarine turned to a small, pragmatic device and an audacious plan. It demonstrates the centrality of leadership that balances risk with withdrawal, daring with preparation. It affirms the capacity of small teams to produce outsized results when careful technique meets resolve. And it reminds us that tactical ingenuity often carries with it ambiguous moral weight. An explosive placed under a rail is at once a clever instrument and a source of human consequence. Today, the tale of the submarine that sent men ashore to bury a time-delayed fury under iron rails has a cinematic quality that has drawn attention in books, documentaries, and museum plaques. But that gloss should not eclipse the particular human elements that made it possible. The electrician who soldered connections by candlelight, the paddlers who learned to read the sea by feel, the commander who gambled on a plan of his own invention, and the small team who carried the weight of a 55-pound charge over cold, unforgiving sand. Those details live in the archival photographs, in the names listed under commendations, and in the frayed edges of a flag hung in quiet display. When a historian stands before that flag, or when a visitor reads the neat lines of an after-action report, there is a temptation, understandable and human, to simplify. The temptation says, heroism, victory, innovation. But history's sturdier obligation is to hold paradox. Admire the skill, note the risk, and respect the fact that such actions took place within a broader, tragic theater. The raid produced immediate military utility, and it also produced consequences that rippled through lives and communities in ways not always neatly tallied. The submarine's experiment in shore strike and sabotage would not remain only an anecdote. In the long sweep of naval thought, it became part of the reasoning that allowed weapons and platforms to migrate between domains. Air-launched rockets to deck-mounted batteries, undersea vessels to carriers of strike. The specific technical improvisations, microswitches, waterproofed dry cells, scuttling charges, were small lessons in adaptability. The doctrinal lesson was larger. Adaptability matters because war rarely gives you the parameters set the manual imagines. By the time public histories and museum curators mapped the operation into exhibits, the men who had been on that beach had long since become private citizens. Some attended reunions, others read the articles and shook their heads at the dramatizations. Their generation had learned to greet bold narratives with a dose of skepticism and a preference for detail. They wanted the facts preserved, the names spelled correctly, and the places verified. In that sense, the archival work matters as much as any flag. It ensures that Saunders, Hatfield, Sever, Newland, Klingelsmith, Richard, Marcus, and Walker are more than mere archetypes. They are named participants whose lives were altered by a single mission's demands. In the decades since, naval thinkers and technologists pointed to operations like Barb's as early examples of what would become routine in modern warfare. The integration of platforms, cross-domain disruption, and the use of small teams for high-leverage tasks. Missile submarines and special operations forces that used the sea as an approach vector drew on a conceptual lineage that included improvised coastal sabotage and rocket tests from decks. Again, this is not a claim that one patrol remade the world, but rather a recognition that patterns of thought emerge from repeated practice and experimentation. And Barb's patrol was one of many experiments that nudged doctrine. When museum visitors stand before a battle flag and read a plaque telling a condensed version of that night, they are receiving a story that is part heroism, part improvisation, and part technical curiosity. The final image, returning us to the quiet tones of memory, is of that flag, worn, folded, preserved in glass. It is a small object that nonetheless announces something large. Ordinary men placed themselves in peril for a mission that required more than courage. It required ingenuity, rehearsal, restraint, and a plan for retrieval. That balance, between daring and the care to bring one's men home, was perhaps the real measure of Fluckey's command, and of the Barb's patrol. The submarine that made a railway into a target taught a lesson about limits and possibility. It showed that with planning, improvisation, and a clear withdrawal strategy, small teams could shape military outcomes in ways that earlier doctrines did not fully entertain. It also showed that such operations left after images, flag, archive, and human memory that survive longer than steel. If you want to follow this story deeper, read crew reports, see artifacts, or learn more about the patrol and its contested place in history, visit the Submarine Force Museum or consult archival collections that hold Barb's logs and after-action files, museum location, and specific archival references to verify. The story, like the ship, has been partly preserved in cloth and paper. The rest lives in careful scholarship and in the memories of those who were there. History often remembers the clever device. It remembers the explosion as a point on a map. But the full lesson is in the work that made the device possible. The late-night soldering, the rehearsed silence, the rafts that slid like black fish under a sky, and the men who trusted one another enough to step into the surf. That is what the flag keeps, and what a museum preserves. Not a simplified moral, but the messy, human, and inventive heart of a small team that changed, in a single night, the way some strategists would think about the sea forever. If this account moved you, and you want to see the artifacts and the records that keep this memory alive, consider visiting the museum exhibit or exploring the linked archival collections to read the original patrol reports and testimony.